If you are trying to improve your fantasy team right before the playoffs, you're in the right spot. A lot just happened in week 10, and some of this will impact your fantasy team. You want to add some players. So let's just get right into it. These are the best options on your waiver wire. And it begins with our number one ad on the week. He's available in over 50% of leagues. The second-year tight end for the Cardinals, Trey McBride, and oh boy, did Kyler Murray like this guy. Look, the upside for McBride started in week 8 when we saw him start to see more of the usage, and then Zach Ertz went on IR. And you can see that right here on our official data partner, Fantasy Life. Week 7, he's kind of split in the role with Zach Ertz. Then Zach Ertz lands on IR. Week 8, what happens? 88% of the routes run. That's elite. And look at this. 40% of the targets is like unheard of at the tight end position. And this led to a massive game on 14 targets. This was still with Joshua Dobbs, who loved targeting the tight end this year. So then there were some concerns. Okay, now that he's gone, well, what's going to happen with Kyler Murray there? And then Clayton Tune last week. Well, last week was really bad. Look, Clayton Tune wasn't great, but it was his first game. The offensive scheme around him wasn't all that good. But this translated to a poor day for the entire offense, including McBride. But this week, he was getting back Kyler Murray. And that connection was on point in week 10. 9 targets, he catches 8 of them for 131 yards. We saw McBride, the athletic tight end, the second-year player, the first tight end taken in the draft last year. We saw him flash all of his abilities in this game. And you can see from this next-gen stats tweet, look, we had Trey McBride, his career high in receiving yards. Okay, we kind of already figured that based on the big day. But look at this. He's been targeted on over 31% of his routes this year. That is top 5 at the tight end position. That's how good this guy's been, available in over 50% of leagues. So McBride is somebody that you want to target. He had literally maybe the best season ever in college football just a few years ago when he earned 134 targets in just 12 games, literally 11 targets per game, put up over 1,100 yards. This guy is great. He's somebody you need to add, should not be on any single waiver wire. And the same could be said about this next veteran running back. And that'll be Devin Singletary, who we've literally been screaming for the last 5 to 6 weeks. Have we slowly seen his usage get better? We've been saying, hey, you should go get this guy. And it was the peak of that in week 6. Because in week 6, we saw Singletary take over this backfield in terms of snaps, overall touches, and targets when Dameon Pierce was active. And you can see that right here when he played 52% of the snaps in week 6. Then they went into a bye week, and then it was kind of just a split backfield in week 8. But Dameon Pierce was injured in week 9. This led to a full-time role for Singletary, 72% of the rush attempts, 75% of the snaps, and this only continued in week 10. And it continued in a major way when the Houston offense, led by CJ Stroud, yet again was putting up a ton of points, and they also leaned on the run. They just ran a bunch of plays, 30 rush attempts, and over 160 total yards for Singletary. Again, there was no Dameon Pierce in this one, but even when Dameon Pierce returns, I assume this is going to be a pretty split backfield because they've trusted Singletary, and he's been more efficient than Pierce. And just to prove a point, Singletary has handled all but one running back opportunity the past 2 weeks. Dameon Pierce wasn't anywhere near that type of usage when healthy. So you want to look to add Singletary and his teammate, who's available in way more leagues. 75% of leagues, Noah Brown, who now the last 2 weeks has had over 150 yards in both of those games. He never had a 100-yard game in his 69 career starts, and in the last 2 weeks, he goes for 150 plus in each. So here's the breakdown on Noah Brown and why he kind of came out of nowhere, but we've been warning you that you should be adding him, especially in deeper leagues the last couple of weeks. Week 1, he was a full-time starter. They signed him this offseason from the Cowboys. He was a free agent, but then he gets hurt. He lands on IR until week 6 when he slowly was very involved. 21% of the targets. Week 8, 19% of the targets. Then in week 9, we finally saw him pop off when there was no Robert Woods and he had a big game. This big game translated to over 150 yards. He was targeted downfield pretty often on just his 6 targets, and it continued the following week. And that past week was what we just saw in week 10. There was no Nico Collins, so more maybe potential opportunities for Noah Brown were in store. And that is exactly what we saw as he was continued to be targeted 15 yards downfield, making the most of all these big play opportunities, catching 7 of 8 targets for over 170 yards, and really was the go-to option, especially on the last drive to set up the game-winning field goal for CJ Stroud and this Texans team. Look, you're getting a wide receiver who's going to run 70 to 80% of the routes in a good offense. There's Tank Dell. There's going to be Nico Collins back soon. So yes, it's a crowded wide receiver room, but Noah Brown has been consistent downfield. And when you look at the wide receiver room, I'm not too concerned when it comes to like the Robert Woods and the John Mechie's of the world. It really is just Nico Collins and Tank Dell. And these guys have their own role in the offense. Where Noah Brown is seeing targets is a little bit different than both of these guys, which means you can get some consistently good flex or wide receiver 3 weeks. Again, not 150-yard weeks, but 60, 70 yards, maybe finds the end zone. Those are going to be stable throughout the rest of the year. So look to add him and this next rookie receiver. But before we get there, 65% of people who are watching this aren't subscribed. Take 2 seconds right now and just hit that subscribe button. Double check if you aren't subscribed. A lot of people just don't know it. It helps me as we push towards 100,000 subscribers. Now that rookie wide receiver is Demario Douglas. He's somebody who has literally been in this video for the last 3 or 4 weeks, but yet he's still available in over 70% of leagues. I get it. He's a Patriots wide receiver. Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi. This offense is not all that appealing, but Demario Douglas continues to produce. Because in the Sunday morning game in Germany, we saw Demario Douglas go out there. This week, he didn't lead the wide receivers in snaps and routes run. That was Juju. But as you can see right here, Juju, even though he had all that usage, only 1 target. He has not been good this year. Demario Douglas, a team high 8 targets, basically double what anybody else on this team had. And this led to another solid day for Douglas as Mac Jones continued to target him. You can see right here, this is reported from a different data source, 9 targets. So even better if they end up being correct. You sometimes see a little bit of a difference in the targets, who's going to be reporting and tracking the games. But in general, still, it led to 6 catches for 84 yards. A strong day in a good matchup. This is now a month straight of good usage for Douglas. And look, it's clear that this offense isn't good, like I mentioned earlier. Mac Jones being benched for Bailey Zappi, both of them throwing interceptions late in the fourth quarter part of the game and not being consistent. But somebody has to produce here, and without Kendrick Bourne the rest of the year, and Devontae Parker battling injuries, and Juju not being great, this leaves Demario Douglas, Tyquan Thornton, who's undersized and hasn't been able to get open, Jalen Reagor, who hasn't done much really at any stop of his NFL career. Douglas seems to be the most promising option, and he's shown that the past month. So consider Demario Douglas a priority add. I'd actually add him over Noah Brown right now, which seems kind of crazy, but that's just assuming Nico Collins comes back next week. And then look to add Tai Chandler, who you might get a week or two of starts out of this guy because of what happened this past week. We saw Alexander Mattison leave the game in the third quarter with a concussion, and he did not return. And typically you're going to miss, based on the new concussion rules, at least a week, especially for running backs, which means Tai Chandler should get a full-time role because, as you remember last week, Cam Akers tore his Achilles. Now, Tai Chandler was the backup before they traded for Cam Akers, and he was the backup in this game, but he was starting to see more usage. Because as you can see from PFF right here, look at the snap counts. 33 for Madison, 32 for Chandler in this game. Well, obviously, Madison didn't play the fourth quarter, left in the third quarter, but before he left, it was actually Tai Chandler and him splitting this backfield. Chandler was more efficient with 40 yards and a touchdown before Madison left. And then Chandler saw 7 more rushes in the fourth quarter. He wasn't all that efficient with them, but they leaned on him later in the game, and they were leaning on him throughout the game. So even when Madison returns, maybe we start to see closer to a 50-50 split because Madison hasn't been efficient. And I don't expect really anybody else to be involved. I mean, we have Kenny Ngannou. He saw some snaps in this game. He is more of a special teams player. He really didn't do too much in college. I'm not too sure he's going to be factored in all that much. He is a fast player, though. He's athletic, but so is Tai Chandler. This is the reason, though, that you want to look at Tai Chandler right here, because next week he could be facing the Broncos, who have been a little bit better as of late, but overall a terrible defense against the run and in general. And then he gets matchups if he starts splitting the backfield with Alexander Mattison against the Bears, the Raiders, and against the Bengals. All great spots. So consider Tai Chandler in all league formats because this is finally a guy that you can plug in and play maybe for a week in a good matchup as you're pushing towards the postseason. Another guy who fits that mold is Brandon Cooks because he's slowly been rising up the past month of the season. He's available in over 50% of leagues and just went absolutely ballistic this past week. This is a guy who's been running all the routes for the Cowboys this season, but he just hasn't been producing until this last game because this Cowboys offense went off and it was led by CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks. Cooks had 10 targets, 173 yards and a touchdown in a really good matchup against the Giants. We've now quietly seen Brandon Cooks score 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games, and Dak Prescott is playing really good right now. Here's how good he's playing. Easily the highest scoring quarterback this last week. He was a top 3 scoring player overall, over 400 passing yards, 5 total touchdowns. Yeah, if he's going to play like this, it doesn't even have to be all the way up to this standard. If he could just play as a top 10 quarterback, the number 2 wide receiver in this offense, Brandon Cooks, is going to come through more times the rest of the year. And he has the favorable matchups to do it because the next month of the season, look at this. These are all bottom 10 secondaries against opposing wide receivers. The Panthers and the Commanders is a great matchup. The Seahawks, solid matchup. And the Eagles is an elite matchup for fantasy wide receivers this year. So look at the veteran Brandon Cooks and consider another running back on his team not named Tony Pollard. And this is the Cowboys backup running back Rico Dowdle because look, he's available in 94% of leagues right now, and this is just one of the handcuffs you want to have on your team. There's no way around saying that Tony Pollard hasn't been good. This was supposed to be his get-right game, and it still didn't happen. He has not been efficient for whatever reason. But his role continues to be unreal, as you can see right here on Player Profiler. Between his carries per game and targets per game, he's seeing nearly 20 opportunities per game. So if something was to happen to Pollard as a somewhat smaller size back at 210 pounds or so, you might see Rico Dowdle take over. And if that's the case, he shouldn't be available in 94% of leagues. He's shown that he could be productive when he gets opportunities. And that was the case in this past game where he saw some opportunities early, but mostly played in the fourth quarter when the starters were pulled, and he was very efficient. He had the long touchdown or the nice touchdown run in this game, 14 fantasy points, and he's kind of been efficient whenever given opportunities, whether it's in the preseason or blowouts in the regular season. Again, he is purely a handcuff. I'm not saying he's taking touches away from Tony Pollard. I'm just saying that when you have all these other handcuffs on other teams like Elijah Mitchell rostered in 50% of leagues behind Christian McCaffrey, this guy Enrico Dotto should be similar, but he's not. Now I'll take you to Green Bay where there's a rookie wide receiver, Jaden Reed, and this offense has been up and down, but this past week, at least Jordan Love looked a little bit more comfortable. It was a good matchup for him against the Steelers, and he looked a little bit more comfortable because he was relying on the rookie, Jaden Reed. This resulted in Reed catching all 5 of his targets. He caught a deep touchdown, like a 20 to 30 yard touchdown. He caught a deep pass late in the game where they were trying to mount a comeback. In key situations, Jordan Love was looking his way and Reed was getting open. Now, when you look at the wide receiver room for the Packers, I mean, it's not all that daunting for Jaden Reed, who I believe is the most talented, to kind of take over and start earning these 6, 7+ targets a week games. I mean, you have Romeo Doubs, who's been great in the red zone, but outside of that, it's kind of been Jaden Reed trusted more in between the 20s. And Christian Watson, it just seems like they're trying to force into a role, which makes some sense as a dynamic player. It's just not working, though, the connection between him and Jordan Love like Jaden Reed's is. So Reed isn't a must start in like 2 wide receiver leagues, but you can consider him in your flex. And if you're a team that has multiple flex options in your league, well, that's definitely where he comes into play. And his matchups are going to be solid moving forward. As you can see, some beneficial matchups against the Giants and Chargers are coming up. And if you were to scroll a little bit more, even more against the Bucks and the Panthers as you head into the fantasy postseason. These are nice spots for a flex option. Now, another wide receiver who kind of profiles out in a similar vein as maybe like the wide receiver 3 on his team, but some weeks he's the wide receiver 1. That would be Curtis Samuel, who's available in nearly 70% of leagues, and he finally returned in week 10 after dealing with a toe injury the past couple of games. And he went right back to what he had been doing all season long. He earned 6 targets, the second most on his team. For his 4 healthy games entering this week, he was averaging over 20% of the targets for the team, and that continued against Seattle for the Commanders. And it continued in a game where he didn't even see his full-time role. Now, he's been the slot wide receiver behind Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin this entire season when healthy, but he saw a lot less usage in this game as he was sort of limited by this toe injury. You can see here, just 31 snaps compared to in the 50s for the other receivers and only 25 routes. Normally, this number is going to be closer to like 40 snaps. So for the wide receiver 3, who is very talented and is earning targets in the #1 pass rate offense, he is somebody worth an ad. I'd prefer him over Jaden Reed, for example. All right, now we got to talk about Joshua Dobbs because obviously he's taking the NFL by storm right now. He's been unbelievable. Kevin O'Connell and him has been a great combination, the head coach for the Vikings, and he's available in over 60% of leagues and is the best streamer based on his upcoming schedule. Dobbs continued his success in his second start for the Vikings. He actually got a full week of practice, and in a tough matchup, it just didn't even matter. Multiple touchdowns, was used on the ground a lot, 25 fantasy points, and was a top 3 option at the position. And things might only get better for him because, look, he seems to love tight ends in general and TJ Hawkinson. You have Jordan Addison out there. KJ Osborne's been dealing with some injuries, but Justin Jefferson was practicing this past week, didn't play in the game, but he should be returning, if not next week, the week after that. And it's really the perfect time for all this to be coming together, the Joshua Dobbs and O'Connell connection, and also Jefferson coming back, because the schedule for Josh Dobbs is elite. A matchup against the Broncos and Bears next makes him the best streamer the next 2 weeks, but then it still stays good against the Bengals, the Raiders. You scroll a little bit more, the Packers and Lions, and a Packers team, by the way, that's down 3 of their starting cornerbacks, 2 by IR and injury, and 1, or defensive backs, not just cornerbacks, safeties as well, and 1 by a trade. This matchups the next 4 to 6 weeks is the best out of any streaming option. So go pick up Joshua Dobbs and pick up this next asset. And look, 4,000 plus if you already have it. I understand that. For the people that don't, though, this is the Fantasy Blueprint, which is going to help you make your fantasy playoffs and take home a championship. Every day of the week for the rest of the season, I send you these tools, whether it's the waiver wire tiers, the key stats database, the game-by-game matchup notes, projections, rankings, and a whole lot more. Here's an example of a previous week's matchup notes, the Steelers versus Jags. You could also filter this by position. You can just see here the specific spots for the Steelers, every single startable player, whether it's the wide receiver cornerback matchups, what those cornerbacks in detail are giving up and how good or bad they are, what the wide receiver has been doing, the running back versus defensive line matchups, and what that defensive line is allowing. This is just a very small sample of what you get in the blueprint. And the blueprint's extremely easy to acquire. That's why so many people have already gotten it. You just scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the description below and follow the 2 simple steps. And these are those 2 simple steps. And here's the deal. It's just $5 for the rest of the year. So I might be saying, oh, but it's already week 11. It's not going to be worth my time. No, it's just $5 for the rest of the year. And if for whatever reason you don't make your fantasy playoffs, it's a tough league, you had some injuries you're dealing with, you just barely missed out, well, I'll just refund that $5. This is risk-free. That is right, 100% risk-free. So you might as well take advantage of it. Just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below to get access today. Back to the waiver wire ads with Rondale Moore. Look, this is a guy who's available in nearly 70% of leagues, and the reason why you want to add him is because, well, Kyler Murray is back and he likes Rondale Moore. Last season, Rondale Moore was efficient and effective with Kyler Murray. He averaged 5.6 catches in his healthy games and was 17th in fantasy points per game. And this solid usage continued this past week. Now, the overall production didn't just 9 fantasy points, but he earned 8 targets and he caught 5 of those for 43 yards. By far the best usage he's seen basically this entire year. Happened to be the first week back with Kyler Murray. I don't think that's a coincidence. So add Rondale Moore in some of your deeper leagues. He should be available in most of them, and then consider this next option. And there's a little bit of nuance here, but it's Rashid Shaheed, and the reason I'm bringing him up is because Michael Thomas got hurt in this last game and did not return. All season long, Shaheed's been somebody that we've said, okay, he's been absolutely dynamic when out there, but he's just not running a lot of routes in this offense. Maybe that changes now with Michael Thomas banged up. And we didn't necessarily see him run more routes this past week, but we did see him get a lot more usage and be leaned on more. And then we saw Jameis Winston come in and target Shaheed. You see 9 total targets here. It wasn't the greatest game, but this kind of keeps him as a lower priority by your league mates and waivers, which is an advantage for you. Because here's the deal. Shaheed has been good this year. It's not just the 1 or 2 highlights you've seen. Check this out. The dude ranks 31st in fantasy points, which overall, I mean, that's not terrible based on what what his role has been, but check this out. Second in fantasy points per target. If Michael Thomas misses time, or just if they start giving Shaheed more opportunities down the stretch here, you might see some massive weeks out of it. So Shaheed is interesting, and so is this next veteran, a totally different type of player in terms of Shaheed being the breakout type of guy, a lot of upside. This next guy's just been consistent. And it's weird to say this, but it's Ezekiel Elliott, who might be over the past 6 weeks of the season an actual better fantasy option than Tony Pollard. What? Look, I don't want to trigger any of the Tony Pollard fantasy managers. I'm one of them as well, but it's just kind of being true. Even in games where Ramondre Stevenson sees a lot of usage, like this past week, relatively sees a lot of usage, you're still getting Ezekiel Elliott playing well. 15 touches, 88 yards, highly efficient, 10 plus more fantasy points without a touchdown. Look, I'm not going to jump up and down and say go get Zeke, but he's available in like 55% of leagues. He's been a solid flex option, and they clearly trust him, not just in the passing game right now, and he finally seems healthy. He wasn't last year. That's why he was really inefficient last year, but also they trust him in the red zone, which will lead to some bigger weeks. Now let's touch on some quick hitters that are trending on Sleeper. One of them in deeper leagues is Kyle Phillips, who's a second-year player for the Titans. Look, Treylon Burks was out. He saw more usage. We'll see what happens if Treylon Burks comes back, but this was a really productive player at getting open in college. Then he was injured in his rookie year, but now he's finally healthy this year, had 61 yards this past week on 5 targets. In deeper leagues, if you still need a tight end and say Trey McBride's not available and some of the other options aren't, there's guys like Luke Musgrave out there, but Michael Mayer has flashed with multiple different quarterbacks now, which is encouraging. He found the end zone on 5 targets in a tougher matchup this past game. We touched on the Cardinals receiver Rondale Moore. Another guy to consider is the rookie Michael Wilson, the bigger receiver, has some red zone upside. He had 5 targets in his debut with Kyler Murray. And speaking of some rookies who were earning targets, A.T. Perry, when Michael Thomas left the game, was actually the direct replacement, and he was seeing more usage in general. He ran the most snaps, the most routes on this team, and saw some solid usage in this game, putting up 2 catches for 38 yards and a touchdown from Jameis, specifically if Derek Carr was forced to miss time. And now let's discuss Antonio Gibson, who was like a darling 9th or 10th round pick in fantasy drafts, maybe even the 8th round in some leagues, and he's been not great most of this year, but over the last 3 weeks, very quietly, he's had at least 5 catches in every game for an offense that continues to throw the ball. Sam Howell has been checking it down to him. We saw Brian Robinson even have like a 100-yard receiving game this past week, checking it down to running backs. This team has been at least targeting them a little bit more. Not somebody that is a priority ad here because he's not doing anything on the ground, but at least worth mentioning. So these are the players that you should be looking at and eyeing on your waiver wire. Now, a lot of them might not be available on yours specifically, but that's why we mentioned a lot of game names, so you can just point out the ones that are. So the waiver wire is one key way to improve your team, but also trading is as well. And the trade deadline might be coming up, so now is the time to get a deal done. This video right here will help you do just that once it's out this week. Now, if you made it to the end of the video, just double check that you're not one of the 65% of people not subscribed to the channel. Just some people just don't know. It helps you see my future content and me as we push towards 100,000 subscribers.